So I'll actually get into the talk. I'm Bentley. That's mostly for recording. But I think any talk should start with an intro as to why you should listen to me babble about something. And so let me explain why. I'm going to talk just really informally about plants and planted aquariums. Really, this is kind of a basic glaze over, but we'll do a question and answer session. And really, since this is informal, if you guys do have questions, feel free to just interject. Don't completely cut me off, please. But feel free to ask them at any time. So why should you listen to me about plants? So the Greater Seattle Aquarium Society has a Horticulture Awards program. It typically takes a person between 1 and 2 years to reach Master Aquatic Horticulturalist. There's 5 levels each time. I've done that 6 times. I am working on number 7, and that should be done probably in a month or 2. And then I'm an insane person. I've propagated and flowered over 130 species of aquatic plants. I have done none of those immersed. Every single one of them has been done underwater. As far as propagation is concerned, flowering, that's a different story. Most of them have to be immersed. But so that's kind of my claim to plant fame. I'm a crazy person who loves plants in my aquariums, and I do a lot of them. So I want to give you some real brief kind of basics. That is, why do plants matter? For us freshwater aquarists, because we only have a little salt in the room, most of us are in fresh, the biggest reason why plants matter is that, 1, they provide natural filtration. You can get some of the people in our hobby who literally don't use filters at all in their tanks. This can be most commonly found in something like the Wallstead method, which is done by Diana Wallstead. There's some more common people if you go online to YouTube. A great person to be a gentleman by the name of Lucas Bretz. He keeps hundreds of tanks. He has no filters on any of them. He has power heads for circulation and plants, and that's it. Most of our fish come from some portion of nature where plants are there in one way, shape, or form. A lot of times, if it's rivers or stream fish, a lot of the Amazon, you tend to have more of your plants over the top. But you do have some that'll be down fully submersed. The Amazon sword is a great example. Why is it called the Amazon sword? It's from the Amazon. So part of why we want plants is that they provide natural filtration. They also provide natural room for beneficial bacteria to grow, which thus adds extra filtration. And finally, a lot of times, most of our fish feel more comfortable in tanks with plants. It gives them spaces to hide, small territories to claim. It can break up line of sight when you have more aggressive fish, say like Apistogrammas or German blue rams, angelfish. When one fish needs to run and hide, they can run around the plant, and that fish will generally leave them alone if they're not really crazy. So once we get past the basics of why plants matter, there's kind of like 3 categories of plants. You have your basic stem plants. You're planting them into your substrate. They're very simple. They're probably the easiest plants out there. You have rosette type plants. So this is things like the cryptocoranes, swords. Those are going to be ones where they have kind of a little root ball and then a crown before the actual plant comes out. Those are usually heavy root feeding plants. And then the final one that matters are all your epiphyte plants. That's a fancy word to say stuff that attaches to rock and wood. These are most commonly plants with a rhizome, so that's going to be stuff like your Anubius, Bulbitis, Java fern. They all technically have rhizomes. The Anubius is the obvious, like that big green chunky part where all the leaves come out of. That's your rhizome. These plants typically, like I said, attach to wood or rock. A lot of times the natural environments that they're in, those areas change the depth of water on almost a daily basis depending on how much it's rained or how hot it is. Some of those plants will be completely out of water one day and completely submerged the next. And the difference in that water volume in a stream or a creek can be upwards of 3 feet. So with that in mind, we want to talk how we feed our plants, right? Fertilizer is the most common thing. Do you need fertilizer? The short answer, yes. The long answer, not necessarily, but if you want to keep them healthy, it helps. It makes it a lot easier. The plants feed in different ways. All plants will feed from their roots and then also from the water column. The problem is, some are better at one than the other. Stems are very good at feeding from the water column. Epiphyte plants, because typically their roots aren't down into your substrate or your sand, they're pulling all of that out of the water column. They're adapted to naturally do that very well. Your rhizome type plants can go into the substrate, and then they'll still pull out of the water system without pulling too much out of your substrate. Whereas rosette style plants like your crypts and your swords, those pull very heavily from within the substrate, almost purely from their roots. Although over time, you can get them to pull from the water column. It's just a game of patience. So the basic stuff, we get into that. So if we need fertilizer, right, there are kind of, I guess I would say, 3 methodologies for doing fertilizer. You have root taps, which is just going to be like a capsule or some kind of hardened compound that you're going to push down into the substrate. You have your all-in-one fertilizers. Those are typically a liquid. I don't think I've ever seen one that's a dry powder, but that's going to be your stuff like Aquarium Co-op's Easy Green. There's Thrive is a more common thing for those that maybe can't make it to the co-op and pick theirs up, or are doing stuff purely off of, like, say, Amazon. There's like a million. Basically, anyone who sells plants in mass probably also has an all-in-one fertilizer that they sell. And sometimes you'll have more split fertilizers, like the Seachem Flourish line. So they'll have, there's Flourish Potassium and Flourish Iron, and then there's Trace, and there's this, and there's that, and there's like a million different bottles. Where you would usually use that is in what's called the EI method, or estimated index. This is if you're a crazy person and really want to go hardcore on your plants. I'm going to give you a hint. I don't do EI. I won't touch it. I'm too lazy. I like very simple solutions. So like I use, because I live close enough to Aquarium Co-op, I use their Easy Green. It's a liquid. I just pump doses, and it's simple. I don't have to think. I don't have to work that hard. So that should tell you that no matter how crazy the plants are or how hard they might get if you really dive very far into the plant game, you don't have to do something difficult to still succeed very well. All of those things, like some of the easiest solutions, end up working the best. It's all about finding what works for you. For me, I have a fairly busy actual life schedule between work and sitting in traffic and hating more traffic, and then finally getting home to complain about traffic and then look at my fish. So I don't have the time or patience to mix typically when you do EI, it's usually a powder is the easiest way to get it, and you're going to mix that into water, and you have to do all this careful science dosing. I'm not a scientist. I'm not that smart. So I do all-in-ones that makes it simple. However, find what works best for you, because all of the solutions work well. It's just about finding what fits you. And honestly, I totally suggest people trying every one if they really want to go into plants, especially if you want to get outside of just green plants. You want to start digging into like some of the cooler reds and oranges and yellows. Those tend to be a little more fertilizer strong, where that you need good fertilizer to make those look good. That's where it's kind of worth like, try root tabs. Now try a liquid. Now try the powder stuff. Find out which one works best for you and which one makes the plants look the best for you, and then do that. Like, no matter what I tell you out of this, even if I'm doing one thing, just because I do it doesn't mean that it is the solution for you. That is just, in my experience, what has worked best for me. But I also do things as dumb as possible, so usually they work for a lot of people. So we've got fertilizer. In order to get plants to grow, we need light. Plants do photosynthesis. We've all taken a very, very basic biology course at some time in our life, and probably were taught that when we were young and kind of just nodded and smiled at the teacher and hoped we got it right on the test. Light is probably actually the most important part about growing plants, especially for people who might have listened to me babble online about plants for profit. That guy right over there. Mm-hmm. Light is actually like your most important thing. Now, that being said, do you need a $400 Kessel light? No. In fact, I would say don't even touch them. But that's personal opinion. I'm sure that the Kessel Company would argue otherwise. But where it matters is that you'll have kind of three categories when it comes to light. You'll have what we call low light, what we call medium, and then what we call high. And these are all based on a basically rating that is called PAR, which the actual term is escaping me, but what it defines is how well the light penetrates through the water. Because refraction of light inside the water causes it to become less and less powerful the deeper the water becomes. That's the most basic way I can explain science that is above my own head. Sorry. When we look at that, low light is typically anywhere between 10 and about 30 to 40 PAR. And a lot of time when you buy an LED light, they'll have their PAR rating somewhere in a little chart on the back. My favorite lights are the Fluval 3.0. They have this lovely chart that tells me all these things in pretty colors, and I just stop and smile and put it on the tank and make it work. Medium light is going to be anywhere between that and about 100 to 120 PAR, and then high light is anything 120 PAR and higher. I've seen something very interesting that I want to say. I had a person online tell me that I should never have my lights at 100% for some of the stronger lights out there, because it will cause the fish to go blind. I see a couple people who know better that are laughing, and let me explain why this is funny. The sun, that glowing fusion reactor in space, on an overcast day in Seattle at water's level produces 3,900 PAR when it's in shade. So even if my light's putting out 400, it's not even close to the sun, and all of us are keeping some kind of fish that tends to stay high up in the water, right where the PAR is going to be the strongest. And what a coincidence, those fish aren't blind. They actually can see that food quite well, and they would love you to feed them again. So if we ever think that I have too much light, the only place where that is the case is you're growing so much algae that the plants are struggling. And usually that is either too much food or too much light. So there's our real basics of what we need, why plants matter, how to keep them alive. So if we're building a planted tank, there's a couple things we need. Number one, substrate. You have to have something to plant the plants in. Sometimes you can do it in a pot and just have a little bit of substrate and not the entire tank. But there's kind of, I guess you'd say, 4 substrates you can look at. I'll start with the best stuff, and that is an Aqua Soil. This is anything like Echo Complete, Seacamps Fluorite, Fluval Stratum, ADA Amazonia, any of the stuff that is designed specifically for planted aquariums. And usually they'll have something about what is called a CEC capacity. All that says is it pulls nutrients out of the water and stores it down in the substrate so that your roots can feed off of that nutrient source out of the soil. Aqua soils are going to be kind of a crutch. That is the easiest way to put it. I use them because, again, I'm lazy and I will take as much help as I can get. That being said, is it the only answer? Certainly not. Number 2, what do we call a dirted tank? This is most commonly done by, if you've ever read Diana Wallstead's book or just heard about the Wallstead method, this is like potting soil in a tank, usually with a little gravel over the top or some sand to make it prettier and so that it doesn't just fly all over the place when you mess with your plants. There are some positives to this and there are some negatives to this. In general, the dirted tank method is designed to work with low light plants and almost no bioload in your tank. So if you have a heavily stocked fish tank, like you are like me, and you keep 1,000 guppies in a 140-gallon tank, dirt can't really handle that bioload of fish poo coming down. It doesn't do well, and over time, you will run into issues. That being said, if you want a little 10-gallon tank, and you're going to have a betta in it, or agarami, or some shrimp, it's perfect. Just keep in mind that with dirted tanks, root-feeding plants that are very difficult, so some of the really rare crypts or something like that, will actually struggle a lot more often than they would in an aqua soil. But if you're just doing something like Pogostemon octopus or Amazon sword or Java fern, you don't need an aqua soil. Dirt is a perfectly good option. The best part, it's cheap. It's super cheap to go out, get a bag of potting mix. There's some specific types. It's pretty easy to find online what you can use. And work from there. There's a million different guides out there on how to do it online. Yeah?
When it comes to the potting soil, I recommend sticking with organic. I have used and done the potting soil method. It does work great. He's very right about the root feeding plants not being able to uptake the dirt, as well as stem plants, for instance. My stem plants did wonderful. I had no issues. But when it came to the root feeding plants, for some reason I was expecting that to be a benefit, but it went the opposite way. It didn't help them.
So part of the reason why that happens is dirt and the next substrate that I'll talk about, sand, under the pressure of water will compact. Mostly aqua soils are either something volcanic or there's some kind of fired clay, so they have a much harder structure to them, and they don't compact as hard. And when you compact around the roots of your heavy root feeders, they start to basically get choked out, where they can't pull as much nutrients, they'll struggle on certain points. A lot of your roots will die and only a few will stay alive, so it's not getting the best health it can get. It'd be kind of like not water changing a fish tank and then also not having plants in to be your crutch to help you.
There's no aeration.
Yeah, over time you're just kind of setting yourself up for a problem. That being said, again, if you have water column feeding plants, especially things like the Java ferns with the super easy stems, it's a great route to go because it's super easy. So that brings me to my next, as I kind of mentioned, sand. So like pool filter sand, like your sandbox sand, all kinds of, there's all sorts of methods to do this, and I'll kind of lump in generic gravel into this as well because it follows the same properties. Most of these are completely neutral, so they're not going to pull any nutrients into them. They don't have any nutrients in them naturally, like a potting soil is going to. If you're doing something like that, a lot of times, sand in particular, like I said, the same thing with the dirt tank, you can have the same issues where it will choke out roots. But in the case of sand, it's even finer than most potting mixes tend to be, so it's going to crush in a lot more. That being said, it is super, super, super cheap. It is super easy, and if you're doing things like epiphyte plants, they don't need to go in the substrate in the first place. So go the cheap route that looks pretty. If you like the look of sand, if you like the look of certain river gravels or things like that, go that route. Perfectly fine, as long as it fits your fish. If you do want to do them with something like, say, dwarf chainsword or some of the really easy but root-feeding plants, just know that you'll probably need to do a thinner layer of sand where possible and use root tabs because they won't have any nutrients naturally in there and stuff isn't going to get sucked down in, so you kind of need some kind of food source for the plants to do well if they feed at the roots. If they feed in the water column, again, don't worry about it. They'll be fine. I've done several tanks with using pool filter sand. I get a 40-pound bag for $12. It does like a 40 breeder in one bag. It's great. It's cheap. And I just put easy stem plants in it, and it looks nice. Simple. The last category is hot pink gravel. And all those like radioactive colored gravels that are painted or something like that. Just don't, please. I beg you, unless it's for like a small child. For my own sanity, please don't. But no, they follow this. If you do like those kind of things, you can get them in like, I remember I specifically had a bag of it that was Seahawks colored that I got with a tank I had basically adopted from someone moving out of state, and they couldn't take their two fish that were living in a 10-gallon with them. You can do stuff in that, but it follows the same rule as like standard gravel. Anything that feeds from the roots, you're going to need something in there to help. Sometimes the plants will have more trouble staying in because the roots can't really grab onto that paint, unlike the natural rock's more coarse and porous surface. But if you love hot pink gravel and you have to have it with your glowfish, but you want plants at the same time, you do you. Just don't like start sending pictures of it to me, please. I beg you, because I might just sit there doing this, and it's bad for my sanity. So we have substrate. We know about light. Let's talk about CO2. This is like the devil in the room, because there's this assumption when you talk to most people. There's like low tech tanks and there's high tech tanks, and the only difference is, are you using CO2? And to me, that's a fallacy, because you can use CO2 and still have your tank low tech. You could use something very simple like a Phoenix Stingray and all super easy plants. There's nothing high tech about what you're doing. You're just adding CO2 to speed your growth. So ignore high tech versus low tech. This is my biggest piece of advice, and I'm sure that as the second I put this online, I'll incite all sorts of nasty comments for saying that. But as someone who works in the software industry, where I deal with tech all day long, having the fact that I push gas into my water column is the definition between low and high tech is just silly. So why would we do CO2? I kind of hinted on it. Speeds your growth up. Do you need CO2? No? Yes? It's kind of one of those. It all depends on your plants, but we got to keep in mind that all of our water has some amount of CO2 in it. Your fish exhale CO2. There is CO2 in your water no matter what you do. And there's a thought that the more flow you have up top, the less CO2 will be in the water because it gases off. But I will propose this to you. There are plenty of plants that we call high tech that in the wild grow in rivers and streams and all these things that have tons and flow at the top. They have flow we could never replicate in an aquarium. But if all that flow is happening, where are they getting CO2? A hint, as much gas is getting churned up here that's coming out is churning back in. It's not just pure oxygen being pushed into the water. It's CO2, it's nitrogen, it's everything. So just keep in mind, if you want to do CO2, you don't have to have almost still water up top. That's another thing that some funky biased science can tell you the wrong answer to. So let's talk CO2. There's kind of three methods. Number one, there is no CO2. This is really great for your low-tech, your simple plants. Anubius, the water sprites, water wisterias, Pocostemon octopus. I'll mention that plant a lot because I love that plant. I keep it no matter how much it might be infuriating to have to cut and remove out of my tanks that do run CO2 every 2 weeks. I keep it anyway because I love it. That's Pocostemon octopus. It's a super common plant. I would argue that it is effectively bulletproof. I'm pretty sure you can't kill it even if you wanted to. I've seen that stuff survive in tanks that even duckweed can't live through. So that should tell you how hardy a plant that stuff is. Unless you're Dean, and then it might not be able to live. I love you, Dean. So if you're doing really simple plants, your low light, very undemanding plants, you don't need CO2. Don't even worry about it.
I do have a question regarding low light required plants.
Low light.
Right,
we'll put it in big
exactly.
quotation marks because it's a weird. That's another weird classification that I hate.
Things like Bucephalandra, right?
Yeah.
I've wanted to do aquascaping with it. I've wanted to try and speed up the growth.
Sure.
And speed up the propagation and whatnot. So
Yeah.
I've spent many hours contemplating the effects of possibly putting low light plants, such as Anubius or Bucephalandra, into a high tech setup with high light, high CO2, and everything to go with it, nutrients and whatnot, right? I've kind of been scared to do it because I don't know the effects it's going to have.
So
it's going to kill it off.
I'll cover that real fast. There's kind of a short answer to this. The main reason why we look at CO2 is CO2 provides a carbon source for our plants. The building block of all life is carbon, right? They can't grow without carbon. There's two options to do there. You can get actual CO2 gas coming into the tank, and that includes like your fish exhaling for those of us who aren't running extra CO2. Or you could do something like a liquid carbon supplement. That is a special realm that I'll address in a second. But when you put when you give more and more carbon in any way, shape, or form to a plant, it allows it to absorb that much more nutrients, and thus it needs that much more light, not necessarily by intensity. Sometimes it's by photoperiod, or how long you leave your light on. But because it allows them to have that much more photosynthesis. They can photosynthesize more and more carbon to create more and more things, use more and more nutrients, and in order to do that, you need more light in one way or another.
Right.
My biggest, I would say, caution with the very slow rhizome-style plants like your Booses and your Anubiuses, with few exceptions. An example would be like the white Anubius variants. They really do need fairly intense light. That is typically, we would typically call highlight. But if you push too much light onto them, you will get all sorts of dust algae over the plant. It usually appears like a black set of algae, like a schmutz, if you will, all over the plant. And I have that at home on a tank that has no CO2, that is medium light, and my Anubius still gets it unless I use plants to shade it.
Right.
So my big caution is only that you can do it, and it will speed your growth. If you want to do that, I wouldn't push a lot of CO2. I personally prescribe to a method when I do a CO2 tank of low and slow. I treat it like American barbecue.
All right.
So an example would be I have 40 breeders that I grow plants in.
Yeah.
I give them 3 bubbles every 2 seconds of CO2. I have about 140 acrylic that runs all sorts of different plants, ranging from Pogostamen octopus, as brain dead as can be, to some fairly high-tech crypts and swords that basically need CO2 in order to look right and not wilt and die. And I still only push 3 bubbles a second into that tank. I think the thing that most people kind of trap themselves with when it comes to CO2 is using too much CO2 and overburdening yourself with the amount of maintenance. Because if you look at like your ADA, your hyper aquascape tanks, they're pushing 10 bubbles a second into a 10-gallon tank. They're pushing so much gas into that thing that the fish are barely getting the right amount of oxygen. And it requires some certain things you can do it. There's a lot of science that I don't want to go into that's too complex. But you also have to maintain those tanks weekly at a minimum, and sometimes it's every 3 days you need to work on them to prevent them from just growing completely out of the tank, killing off all the low growth, and looking hideous and ugly. Where if you go very low amounts of CO2, if you choose to do CO2, maybe you want a little bit better color, a little bit more robust or dense growth, go really light. Go simple. Start simple, and then if you want to go higher and higher, maybe you want some you decide you want some real crazy rare stem that only 3 guys on Facebook have, or something crazy nonsense like that. That's when you start looking at slowly dialing yourself up. I think the biggest lesson I have learned in doing plants is don't try to go for the tippy top right away. Start slow, give yourself a challenge, meet that challenge, go just a little bit above that with a new challenge, meet that challenge, go a little bit above that, new challenge. That is literally how I got the level of insane propagation of plants that I have, is that I just found a new challenge effectively every month. And slowly stepped myself up, slowly came to a better and better understanding every time. That's it. Just play it slow, play it easy. You learn so much better if you do it a step at a time instead of barraging yourself with everything at once. So to get back on to final tracks, you have no CO2. You have like the DIY CO2 method. This usually involves like some empty pop bottles, some yeast and some sugar and some complex mad science rig that's running tubes into your tank. How do I put this politely? It's cheap compared to buying one CO2 regulator. However, the amount of headache and the inconsistency of your CO2 makes it not worth it. You might as well have no CO2. That's my opinion. What do I know? I'm just some random guy. But I would argue that the investment of even some of the cheapest CO2 regulators that are out there on Amazon, you can find them for like $50 that have a solenoid built into them, is worth every penny, knowing that your air is always consistent, that it's always on time, and then at night when there's no light, you can turn it off. So that brings us into pressurized CO2. This is kind of like I've decided I want to step my plant game up a little. I want to try CO2. Like I said, my personal philosophy is low and slow. I think less CO2 is necessary, especially if you don't want to be in your tank like every 3 days working on your plants. I can only assume that everybody at this table has a relatively busy schedule like mine, and you don't have that much time, or more importantly, maybe you'd like to actually enjoy your fish and not just cut and trim plants and replant plants and all this kind of nonsense every time you want to look at your fish tank. The easiest way to start, like I said, is find a reasonably priced CO2 regulator. I personally like spending a little bit more on my regulators because there's a slight difference in quality that just lets you, they're usually easier to fine-tune adjust to get it if you want a specific bubble count. That this is a word we use a lot. It basically just, you'll have a small thing filled with water and you watch the number of bubbles coming up that tells you roughly how much CO2 you're pushing into your tank. There's all sorts of fancier ways to gauge actually the parts per million of CO2. You really don't need that, I'll be honest. You just don't. Drop checkers, you don't need those either. I know a lot of people will scream at me like, of course I need a drop checker in my CO2 tank. No, you don't. You just don't. I don't have a single drop checker. I don't ever have to test to figure out my exact parts per million. I just know how much is pushing through, and I can watch the growth of my plants, and that's all I have to do. As long as the plants aren't dying and the fish are doing just fine, everything's fine. Plants are so much simpler than everybody thinks. If an idiot like me can do it, anyone can do it. Guaranteed. Because when I first got back into aquatics, I killed all sorts of plants because I didn't know what I was doing. And the answer to that is simple. Why did they die? Most plants, when you get them, are grown in farms immersed, and you have to convert them. Unless you're lucky and buy from a few sources. I will mention Aquarium Co-op once more. It's almost like that's my local fish store, and I like giving them some love. But more importantly, like there are some places that will take the time when they get their plants in from farms. They will put them in tanks. They usually run some extra CO2 to speed that process along to get them to go from being an immersed grown plant to submerged growth. So if you buy a plant from, especially if it's in a bundle and not in a pot, and you buy it from Joe's Plant Shop online because you saw this plant that you haven't seen in a fish store locally and it looks really neat, and it comes in and you put it in your tank and within a week all the leaves are falling off and the stems look like it's starting to die back a little bit, don't pull that thing out right away. Instead, trim off whatever has died off so that it has an open part to its stem especially. And what that will do is it'll trigger new growth, and that new growth will come in already adjusted to the water system, and then you're fine from there on out. I cannot tell you the number of plants that I was like, oh no, it's dead, and I pulled it out of my first tank when I got back into aquatics because I didn't want to risk hurting my fish, my beloved cardinal tetras that I'll never own ever again. I have a bad history of cardinal tetras and neon tetras. I've never succeeded well with them, no matter how much I love them. Which is why I do rainbow fish, because they're like tanks and they got all the color I could ever want. Anyway, so the final kind of part about CO2 is when we go to lighting and CO2 combined. I talked a little bit about how the more CO2 you push, the more light you can effectively need. It doesn't mean intensity. Like I said, it can mean photo period. So a lot of us will control light using timers. Some of our lights have built-in applications. Like great examples would be the Fluval lights. Some of the Finex 24/7s have their own built-in programming where they keep a timer and they do it for you. There's plenty of cheaper made lights that have optional timers you can buy for them. One of my favorite go-tos, if I'm being a cheapskate, is a Beamswork F-Spec that you buy off Amazon. It's made in China. It lasts for like 1.5 to 2 years, and then they kind of fall apart on you. But for that 1.5 to 2 years, they're actually a pretty decent light for how cheap they are. This all being said, why the timing matters. When you're running CO2, you need light. And you probably want your light off at night so your fish can rest. Well, you don't want to keep pushing CO2 while the light's off because the plants aren't absorbing it during that period of time. They're not getting light, they're not photosynthesizing. unless you have some really insane ambient light coming in from your room or a window, or you live in Alaska in the summer when there's no such thing as night for like a month and a half, and all your tanks are somehow outdoors because you're some kind of mad, crazy science person that I don't understand. Basically, if you have your light on a timer, have your CO2 on a timer. And the only difference that we want to do here when we put CO2 on a timer is somewhere between half an hour and an hour to before your light starts coming on, turn your CO2 on. If it's low, if you run really high CO2, like you're a crazy ADA guy and you want 800 million billion bubbles a second, don't wait until your lights are on. Don't gas your fish, please. Please, for the sake of your fish, don't gas your fish. But the reason why we do this is we want to let that extra CO2 accumulate in the water column before the plants get light and begin to go into their photosynthetic process. Makes sense? We're building up excess carbon so that the second they're turning on the grow machine, they've got all the carbon they could ever want in the water column. And then again, if you are turning off your lights at a certain period of time, turn your CO2 off that same amount of time. So if you're turning it on half an hour before your lights come on, half an hour before your lights go off, turn your CO2 off. That last little bit of time, it'll sit there, it'll absorb the last little bits out of the water column. Safe, you don't have to worry about hurting your fish. Makes it easy. A cheap $10 timer from Home Depot will fit both your light and that if you want to do it at the same time and be super easy, or you can buy two and have one on CO2 and one on light. Perfect, easy. So we have what we need, right? We need light, we need substrate, we need some plants, and we may or may not need CO2. So how do we get more plants? Propagation, right? Plants in the wild propagate a number of different ways. So we talked about our three categories. We have stems, we have rosettes, and we have your epiphytes, rhizomes, however you want to clarify it. Some of them don't have a rhizome, which is why we just call them epiphytes in mass. Stems are simple. You cut the top of the stem off, or at some portion. I like to go somewhere between like 3 and 4 inches from the top of my substrate and clip. From that point, new child stems are going to grow out of the top. And that top portion that you cut off, it's going to trigger the bottom to grow new roots. Because in the wild, they'll break, whatever happens, they'll float downstream, they'll eventually catch back somewhere, and they'll grow new roots and dig in, and they'll repropagate in a new spot. Great examples of this, you can go to spots in Florida and see tons of Ludwigia out in the wild, because it's a naturally occurring plant here in North America. And if you'll see it in like a giant patch here, and then you go another 30, 40 feet downriver, and there's another giant patch here. Well, at some point, that was 1 or 2 stems that broke off because a fish hit it, or a fish was trying to spar for territory, or breeding in it, or just bit it, whatever. That floated down and eventually settled somewhere, regrew roots, and started the next batch of that plant. Some stems will, over time, grow side runners, just like some of the other styles of plants do. But for the most part, the way we propagate them is by clipping them and replanting the new one. So you could start with literally a single pot of Pogostemon octopus, like I did when I came back to the hobby. And in 3 months, you'll have enough to fill a third of a 125-gallon tank, like I did when I came back to the hobby. It's pretty simple. Stems are like the most easy thing, which is why I generally suggest stems to people. When you get to rosettes, it's a little different. This is going to be your crypts and all that kind of stuff. They're going to push their own runners naturally. Probably the scourge and or favorite of a lot of people are like your dwarf chainswords or jungle val, dwarf sagittaria. You'll put a couple of them in your tank and they look really cool. And then a month later, it's your entire tank. And you're sitting there going, I can't even see my fish. How do I get rid of these stupid things? Some of them are more prolific. Crypts are, of course, way slower at doing this. However, they grow the same method. They're going to push a little runner out to the side. It's going to spring up somewhere, and it's a whole new plant. You just kind of fire and forget with those plants. And if you do ever want to pull them up, they'll usually have a thin strand between them. You just clip that, and you can repropagate however you want to. Or if you want to push them more dense together, you can do that on your own accord. The other way that some rosette plants will do, and this is mostly swords, is with a child spike. So if you've ever seen a sword, it'll have this like big, long spike coming off, and then an army of little babies trying to grow out of your tank. This is primarily only done by swords. I think, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I think there's one other type of plant that does this. Usually it's identified with swords. they just do it on their own. You just let it happen. And then once those grow a little bit of roots and you have some leaves there, you just go on each side of the rosette and you clip that child stem spike portion off. You plant it down in the substrate. You have a new baby sword. Or maybe you give it to your friend and let them enjoy the beauty that is an Amazon sword and warn them that the root ball will take over the entire tank in about 6 months. So when you try to pull it out, it's a monster that you never expected.
So when you clip,
Yeah.
you're saying when you clip the stems, they trigger new growth.
Right.
The roots. So say you have a stem plant that had outgrown and gone up to the top of your tank.
Yeah.
The leaves are dying off down below.
Uh-huh.
They don't need them. If you clip that where those leaves are starting to die, will those leaves start to grow back on the portion of the stem that has died off?
So typically you will not regrow leaves, but from that cut point, you'll have anywhere between 1 and 4 new stems start to grow out. I personally, if I ever am so busy that I can't maintain plants right, usually it's Pogostemon octopus. You're going to notice a pattern with this plant with me. I will just rip that portion out and replant the new clip-off point. And then a lot of times what you can also do is you can reclip that thing if it's gotten too long, like 3-foot Pogostemon octopus.
Can you clip right out where the leaves stop growing and then down close to the substrate and it will regrow that substrate? Or is there not
Typically, yeah.
Okay.
As long as it has a healthy root system and it has some nutrients it can pull upon, because they'll store nutrients in parts of their stem and the roots.
Yeah.
The second that cut or that break happens, it triggers growth. It's just the way that they exist in nature. So sometimes they won't and sometimes they will. It's sometimes a little bit of a gamble, which is why I personally, if I've let it go that far, I'll rip that piece out and just start fresh. But that being said, it's all about your own personal setup. Experiment. Have some fun with it. I approach my aquatics as my ability to interact with nature without having to go out into the scary outdoors with the glowing death orb. But it's kind of one of those things where, like, it depends on how much nutrients are sitting in that little bit of stem that's left over and in the roots that it wasn't using to keep pushing that growth as to whether or not it will successfully regrow. Most of the time, it depends on how easy that plant is. Like, super hardy plants will just do it anyway. They're nigh on invincible. And then others, like if you're having this, I've got this Rotala species 937 that came from one collection trip in Taiwan 5 years ago. There's some real crazy stuff if you go too far on the internet. Those are usually pretty fragile, and if they get to that point, they're not coming back. You just got to rely on that piece you cut off to come back to life for you. So just keep that in mind. That's kind of my way to say, like, do easy plants until you get real confident. And then dive deep. Have a lot of fun. And or frustration, depending on who you are. So, yeah.
Question. You went over 3 main types of plants, the Rosettes, stem plants, and
Epiphytes. Yeah.
Epiphytes. What about carbon plants like Monte grass or Monte Carlo? What are they called?
Sure. So those are like a weird hybrid. They are technically effectively rosettes, because each of those individual little plants has that small root piece where it comes to a crown and then has a plant that grows out of it, and typically they have it like a chain sword, have a chain of vine that's coming across. There's a more sciencey way to define them. Again, I'm not a scientist, so yeah. Terrible answer, I know. Shoot.
Go ahead.
Floating plants.
Yeah.
What are they? Where do they go?
They're floating plants.
Oh, they have their.
So
not,
they're kind of their own main. They're their own main category. I kind of ignore floating plants because.
Isn't that what this is?
No. That's a plantable plant. That particular water sprite. It does love to float. Some of the stems do like to float. One that I personally grow floating all the time is water wisteria. It's amazing. Duckweed is not a plant. It is cancer. Yes, I did.
They love that.
So let's address floating plants. The reason why I normally don't is because they kind of cheat on all the rules that normal plants underwater do, because the top of the plant where it absorbs a majority of its light and, most importantly, CO2, is exposed to the atmosphere. And the atmosphere currently is somewhere between 390 and 410 parts per million of CO2, which if you put that in the water, you'll kill every fish known to man. So they kind of cheat in the sense that floating plants, the reason why they're so prolific is because they can pull all the carbon they've ever wanted that plants can't possibly get at that level down under the water. They all do, most of them have a root structure and function very similar to a rosette. The difference is just that they kind of cheat the rules because they float and they get free CO2 as if you were pushing more CO2 than you could ever think about, and you'd go through a 20-pound canister every month on a 10-gallon tank. So I kind of ignore floating plants because for the most part, any floating plant is just huck it in a tank and make sure it gets light and it's fine. Because they're probably the least demanding plant, and depending on your personal opinion, they might also be the scourge of your existence.
So, temperature. Having a discus tank, a planted discus tank, I've had a very hard time getting my plants to tolerate the lower temperature.
Sure. So, plants and temperature is actually a really important topic that is not on my cheat sheet because I made this up Monday at work.
Perfect.
On my lunch break. Most plants tend to be, our tropical plants at least, tend to be in the low 70s and at most about 78 in the wild, where you're going to see fully submerged plants. Now, stuff where you'll see more epiphyte type plants like your buses in Borneo and things like that, yeah, they're going to get super hot, but the water itself is actually cooler because it's a fast-moving stream system.
Yeah.
So adjusting plants to hot water, or in the other case, a lot of plants tend to be in soft water naturally. There aren't a lot of plants that grow in very hard water, with the exceptions being some of the things that are native to Africa, like Anubius and some species of Wisteria. So getting them to adjust to hot water is pretty simple. What plants are in that environment in nature? Amazon swords.
Right.
It sounds kind of sucky, right? Because you want to have really cool stuff. But honestly, the thing is, if you are running something like discus, or even there are some smaller dwarf cichlids that run pretty hot, and if you wanted to somehow run plants with them, the real thing comes down to find a plant that comes from an environment that is naturally quite a bit warmer. You're going to have to start growing it in a different tank and slowly ratchet the temperature up. Because you have to slowly acclimate that plant. Because when it's grown in a farm, it's probably grown in like 60 degrees in open air with only its roots in water. And the second you put it into that hot water fully submerged, you're going to shock it and kill it. Because it's too much change at once. But if we get it first used to being underwater, and then we slowly ratchet that temperature up, it will adjust and it'll be able to do it. The biggest thing is finding the plants that can handle that level of temperature. Unfortunately, that's a really small list, and it's mostly Amazon sword.
Okay.
There are some other swords that can take that kind of heat that are in the same family, but for the most part, it tends to be those super robust plants like that. Some Java fern will also do really well. It typically, none of the needle leaf stuff. It has to be the big broadleaf stuff, just because that's got a better chance of absorbing light. And the finer the plant is, typically the slightly less hardy it is when you compare things that are what we normally associate with impossible to kill, like Java fern.
Right.
Okay, so other than stem propagations, if we look at rhizome style plants, they propagate very differently. So if your rhizome is my finger here, and you've got all your leaves coming off of it, you basically just want to divide it in half. Find a part where you can not cut leaves off, although you can cut leaves off of almost all of them and they'll just regrow over time. Just cut it very cleanly in half. The most common suggested is using a razor blade because it gives you a very fine, clean cut, or just very good, sharp scissors. So if you have some of the scissors that are designed for aquascapers or for aquariums, those tend to be a little sharper. They have a bit of a finer edge to them, because they're not getting as much resistance as, say, a knife that you're going to use and abuse opening boxes or chopping, a butcher's knife chopping through hunks of frozen meat or something like that. Just you want something sharp because you want a very clean cut. If you get a kind of jagged, bad cut, it can lead to rhizome rot, which normally is something that the science community hasn't really figured out as to why this happens in rhizomes. But I've noticed in my personal experience, if you have a bad cut, it can cause that to start setting in. So when you divide rhizomes, a very clean cut is key. That's about it.
So if you're re-aquascaping and you break some, you want to cut those clean?
Cut it clean. It's the safest way to make sure that the plant does all the things it needs to be healthy and not have issues. Go ahead.
So I do it, I use terrestrial epiphytes.
Yeah.
And orchids and stuff. So the razor blade part is important simply because if you're using scissors or a snipper or some type of tool, you're applying a crushing pressure to the rhizome.
Yeah.
So what you're doing is crushing it, it's going to rot. So if you can cut it cleanly without much pressure, you have a better chance of keeping that plant than if you crush it.
Cool. So I'll repeat that just for my own purposes. The reason why we really want a razor blade is that using a scissor, especially if it's not a crazy sharp scissor, you're going to have some amount of crushing power, and that's one of the key factors in causing that rhizome rot or some other kind of damage that prevents that plant from staying healthy. There you go, YouTube. You're happy. So kind of one of the final, I would say, propagation methods comes from Java ferns. So Java ferns cheat because they do it two different ways. You can divide their rhizome, which is this very thin kind of network that looks more like a crazy root system than an actual rhizome, but it is a thin rhizome. Or, for those of us who like experiments, you can stress the Java fern by not giving it proper nutrients or giving it poor light, like as in no light. And on the back of a Java fern, if you look at it, you're going to have these little dots. Each of those is a little seed. And the second that plant starts getting stressed to the point of where it thinks it's not going to survive, those seeds all become little baby plantlets. And they grow surprisingly fast because that Java fern will absorb all of its own nutrients and kill itself to make all these baby plants survive. And then once they hit about yay big, really they don't have to get very big, that seed kind of attachment there becomes extremely weak and just a little bit of flow and they'll fly right off. So I have personally, with a couple different species, stressed them the bajiminy out by putting them in no light whatsoever. And waited until they started to propagate, turned all my light and nutrients back on to keep the plant alive, get all the babies to go, and then once they get to about yay size, I'll go in and just lightly run my hand kind of up and down the back of the leaf, and it'll loose all those child plants. So if you look, for those of you who watch my YouTube channel at all, if you look in my guppy mansion, where Leanne's guppies are, there's a huge swath on the right-hand tank of all this Java fern Wendelov. Those were all teeny tiny baby plantlets that I shoved into every little hole of a bunch of cholla wood, and then just put it down and let it grow. So it's you ever want to learn a cool experiment from me? I wasn't sure if that would work. Turns out it does. Because Java fern is crazy, crazy versatile and also crazy hardy. So that's basic propagation. The last kind of thing I'll go over is some setup tricks and my secret. Because I have a secret. That's why I'm so good. So a couple tricks. If you're using something like sand or the Wallstead method, if you want to prevent compaction, go to any hydroponics store. Your nursery section in most hardware stores will carry this. Any actual true nursery, there will be small lava rock that is about yay big in a bag that's dirt cheap. Put a single stone layer worth of that lava rock at the bottom, and then put everything else over the top of it. That will allow the roots to grow into a place where there's this nice porous material, and they won't get choked out. Push your root tabs down into that area, and they'll have all the nutrients they've ever want, and they will stay healthy, and you can still use the pretty look of sand, or something like if you want a dirted tank and you want to do a little more root oriented plants, there's your fix. Trick number 1. Yeah.
Doing your lava rock method, would that not be a good backup bio
So
thing going on down there?
it does give you a little biocapacity. The problem is because you're going through dirt or sand when it's compacted like that, which is normally when I would use this trick, you're not having a lot of water flow that's truly getting down into there. So you're less likely to have the oxygen-rich bacteria that we want typically. You could, in theory, try to use that as a way to build anaerobic bacteria, but I would just say don't worry about anaerobic bacteria in the first place. You really don't need it.
Is this a good way to prevent cyanic bacteria as well?
Yes and no. I don't think it cracks the code because I've had cyanobacteria while doing this in the past. I think it just is a thing that you kind of can't fight because it's just going to be in the water column naturally, and over time, if it finds something to take advantage of, it will. It's like any algae will do the same thing. If it finds something that's in excess that it can take advantage of and grow off of, it will do so. That's just nature. It's hard to fight nature, but in the case of cyanobacteria, that's what erythromycin is for. So my second trick is laterite. The easiest way to get this is typically in CChem's fluorite red. And all laterite is an iron-based substance. So if you like growing crypts actually, regardless of their color, need more iron than most other plants. Without iron in a reasonable amount, they will just wilt and die. They will not grow lush, they will not grow healthy. That's kind of a secret that a lot of people don't seem to know very well about crypts, is they need more iron than you would normally think. The easy solution to that, other than supplementing iron in your fertilizer dose, is using some amount of a laterite-based substrate. There's a lot of different ways you can get this, and just mixing it in with the rest of your substrate. So it doesn't have to be purely laterite. You could get like a single bag of fluorite red and mix it in with 10 bags of any other Aqua Soil, and that's going to give you that little boost of iron you need. It doesn't take much, but for any place where, especially if you have lots of red plants, adding that little bit of natural iron down at the roots that will also kind of slowly break up and get into your water column will help them long term. That being said, if you're doing a lot of red plants, like I like to do in several tanks, just dose iron in your water column and they'll be fine. On that same side, there's calcium supplements like marillonite clay, crushed coral, crushed oyster shell, cleaned off egg shell left over from your atypical chicken egg. Anything that's going to have calcium naturally in a shell of some form that can dissolve into the water column and produce calcium. The most common thing, if you see you have a plant and the leaves start curling down like this, that's a calcium deficiency. It's actually really common for those of us up here in Seattle because our water has nothing in it, that we're not necessarily putting enough calcium into the water, and you'll see curving leaves. Or if you keep something like a rainbow fish like I do, you need that hardness in your water anyway. So using a little bit of crushed coral, you can mix it into your substrate, you can put it into your filter box, however you decide to do it. Adds a little calcium to the water, helps with a lot of different things, especially plants that like something a little more hardy. An example would be like your Anubiuses tend to like slightly harder water. That's where they do a lot better. A little bit of crushed coral and you're set. Really simple.
You mentioned the all-in-one liquids. Don't they have enough iron in there to feed? Like I have one lily that I've been struggling to get started. It's got red leaves, and it's sent up a couple of runners of the red leaf up there, but now both of those have kind of died down and look kind of sickly, and I looked at the bottom and it's got a whole lot of leaves coming up, but they're much more green than red.
So in most of the all-in-ones, they have a small amount of iron, but not enough to like get those really dark reds. Like red tiger lotus is a great example. I love that plant. And to get it like crimson red,
That's
like
what that
fire truck red, it really is just supplementing extra iron. So like if you're using aquarium co-ops stuff like I do, it's pretty much just buying Easy Green, and then they have another product called Easy Iron. And it does not take very much. The dosage suggestion is usually 1 pump per 10 gallons on the tank. But if you only have one set of red plants, like just red tiger lotus or just
That's what I've got.
just a Ludwigi or something like that, half that dose, and that's enough. Just that little boost of iron is really all it takes. If you want really deep reds, I actually suggest doing a full dose twice a week. Once you have enough plant density. When you only have like one or two, just once a week is perfectly fine. In one of my tanks where I keep all my red tiger lotus, I have something like 20 of them that I've grown out over time, and I double dose that tank, and they are crimson red at all times. I never see them green.
The one thing I've done is you can go to like a craft store and you can just buy the clay bricks that they have for molding, and you just cut it in little squares and put it down by the roots.
Yeah, that's another option. Some of that red clay does have a bit of iron in it. It's kind of a cheater way.
Just red clay for modeling clay,
Yeah, they just come in little
like
bricks.
at Michael's or something.
Yep.
And the other thing is a lot of the
That won't hurt the other plants or the fish.
typically no, you just put a very small amount down there. Another thing is when you look at root tabs, if you get some of the ones that are naturally a more red tone or a clay kind of tone, those typically come from, they have some clay base in them that has a lot more iron in them. For some of those plants, just put one of those down in there. It'll feed them for like 3 months.
Is that called?
Any of the root tabs, there's a couple different varieties other than say like Seachem root tabs. You can get some of them are squares or discs. They come in all sorts of different shapes, but they'll be more of a tan or red color naturally. And if need be, I can send you some. But there's a couple of different brands that make them, and they have a higher iron content naturally because the base of that root tab is actually a little bit of clay that's mixed in with all the nutrients to hold it as basically a stabilizer.
But they're not advertising it as a iron.
Not typically, no. Some of them do, but not all of them.
And the other thing about the calcium, if you go to like a farm store or a co-op, they have what's called oyster grit. They use it for chickens.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
You can get a 20-pound bag for like $10.
Yeah.
Instead
Also, if you have any form of Asian food store near you,
Yeah.
you could very often get leftover oyster shell from them in bags and just clean it with a quick boil and then crush it up, and it's just like crushed coral.
How much oyster grit do you throw in? A lot?
So when it comes to crushed coral and oyster grit, things like that, typically like a handful in a 40-gallon tank is enough. If you're trying to really buffer your pH up, like you have some of the harder water fish, I know Corey from Aquarium Co-op tends to suggest a pound per 10 gallons. And that usually doesn't push it so high that plants struggle. So my final suggestion in here goes back to crypts specifically. Quit making noise. And that is grape leaves.
What?
Grape leaves. So if you were doing Mediterranean cooking where they'll use grape leaves for grape wraps and things like that, grape leaves naturally are actually a very high source of iron. So instead of laterite, kind of like a root tab, you could every once in a while take some dried up grape leaves, roll them up, push them down on the substrate, right by whatever plant needs iron source.
You gotta be dry.
I suggest dry. If they are some of the ones you'll get wet that are typically used for doing the grape leaf wraps, a lot of Mediterranean cooking, just do a quick blanch boil on them. That'll sanitize them, and then you can kind of shred them up and put them down in there in kind of like a wrapped up pill, basically. So with those kind of little setup tricks, that's not all of them. There's 1,000 different things that you can do, but those are the most common ones that I would ever look at, because you'll have people who live in soft water that need something a little harder, people who don't have enough iron, little things like that. Those are those tricks. So I'll get to finally my secret. There is none. That's the trick. There's no secret. Plants, the thing about plants is that it's trial and error. Just like anything in life, we learn from failure. Sure, we learn from success, but when you screw up, you learn much better. Because it hurts a little inside. And that pride thing comes out and goes, not again. No. Right? It's the secret is really simple. It's find what works best for you in a combination of things. If you're doing low light plants, but you need something to get maybe better growth, leave your lights on longer. People on the internet will go crazy about that, and I'll tell you this. I leave my lights on 13 hours a day. And I don't have issues. Now, if you're just starting a tank, don't have it at full blast 13 hours a day. That's how you get algae. And I've done that plenty of times. No matter how many times I tell myself, no, I've done it right the first time, this time. It won't happen this time. Oh, my glass is green. All right, I did it wrong. So that kind of covers the basics. The last thing I want to touch on, and it's really short, is a concept of what's called a siesta. And all this means is in the middle of your day, you're turning your lights off and then eventually turning them back on. So you'll have basically 2 miniature day cycles. Where this is used is over time, even with injected CO2 tanks, unless you're pushing a ton of CO2, the plants will absorb more CO2 than the CO2 is pushing into the water system, and the amount of available carbon goes down. So you'll get this period in the middle of maybe your day, your photosynthetic period, where there's not enough carbon and the plant can't grow as robustly as it could. Most commonly, the way to fight this is called a siesta period, where you turn the light off, and that lets the carbon build back up a little bit, and then you have a second day cycle. You'll have 2 short, 3 or 4 hour day cycles, and you'll have a similarly long break in between. For those of us who just want to make our power bill cheaper, you have your lights on in the morning to see your fish in the morning. While you're at work, your lights are off, they're not costing you money, and then they come back on a little bit before you come home, and you get to see your fish in all their glory and enjoy them for a little bit, and then they're going to go back off in a few hours, and you can go to sleep. Sure.
Does it hurt the fish at all?
No, not really.
The artificial lights?
Not really.
Just have the light that you get in the day and...
Yeah, typically most fish are fine because, especially, there are plenty of fish that live in deeper environments that get less light than even that ambient light is going to give you in an aquarium. I haven't seen anything that has definitively said that this is bad for your fish. However, with all that being said, I will say this. I've talked to several friends, and some of them work in the professional horticulture industries, growing things like basement tomatoes that are very legal in this state, but not in other states. Those tricky basement tomatoes. Every professional grow house, whether it's vertical farming for things like microgreens or whether it's basement tomatoes, that used to do siesta periods to boost their growth, stopped doing that. Stopped doing that. That should tell you something. Now, the argument in favor of a siesta is that, well, of course they're going to stop doing that. Those plants are exposed to atmospheric CO2. They've got more CO2 than you can ever put in the water without killing your fish. It's not the same. If you really need that CO2 growth, if you think that that's your issue, there's probably a different problem going on that can be addressed that doesn't require it. However, if you just want to save a little on your power bill, just if you're pushing CO2 into the tank, make sure you turn the CO2 off or down a little bit. Like very similar, you could have your CO2 go for, an hour before it has that 4 hour period, stops an hour before that period, turns off for a little bit, and then an hour before the lights are coming back on again, it kicks back on, it pushes the CO2 into the water column. It's like repeating your day cycle twice in very short periods, as opposed to one very long period. That being said, outside of some testing I did specifically to see how a light functions when you deny it power, and then turn it back on when it has automated programming, I don't ever use a siesta, nor will I. But if it works for you, do it. There are plenty of people who grow some of the hardest plants I've ever seen online that have pictures of tanks far more beautiful than I can ever comprehend, doing with my own hands, that swear that the only way to get that is by using a siesta. I think it's just kind of personal superstition. So that is my informal talk about plants. And we'll do some questions still if you got some left those. Go ahead.
Okay, so you talked about skip the powders, get something like easy.
Yeah. Unless you really want to go hardcore.
Right, and then maybe some easy iron or some sort of iron. What about the products like the liquid carbon instead of CO2?
Sure. I meant to talk about that and I skipped it because I'm a terrible person. So liquid carbon, the problem with liquid carbon is this. Every liquid carbon product out there, in order to make it work and get absorbed in the water column, also requires a compound called glutaraldehyde. Glutaraldehyde is the anti-algicide amongst many other things that it does that is in those products. It's not the carbon that kills the algae, it's the glutaraldehyde. The problem with that is that many plants, one of the best examples is going to be Madagascar lace and a lot of similar Aponigeton plants. The second that you introduce that glutaraldehyde, they die. You can do a single dose of Flourish XL and have a massive Madagascar lace like I have that puts out 4-foot long leaves, and that entire plant will melt, and if it doesn't get pulled out of the water within a few days, will just kill its root ball entirely. However,
How do you know?
I've got friends that have done it.
No, I mean, you use the Flourish XL and you think, oh, this will fix my algae problem.
Sure.
You've got a
There's-
multitude of different types of
There's a really small list of plants that are susceptible to it. It is basically some of the Vallisnerias. Some of them will resist it, some of them won't. Jungle Val tends to resist it, but a lot of the stuff like corkscrew vals, Vesuvius, some of the smaller chain swords like pygmy chainsword or dwarf Sagittaria, and then basically all of the Aponogetons. Those are the plants that do not like glutaraldehyde. Every stem, Java ferns, Anubius, they don't care. And there are a lot of people who will swear by liquid carbon dosing every single day as opposed to using CO2, and I will just tell you it's so much more expensive, it's not worth it. A bottle of Flourish, especially if you're dosing, trying to replicate pressurized CO2 in a year, will cost you more than 3 CO2 regulators that are good and refilling that bottle once a month. It's just going to cost you more in the long run. If I was going to go that route where I wanted it specifically to add carbon to my water, I would just go buy a reasonable CO2 regulator, a like 5-pound tank of CO2, and especially if you can find a used tank on like a Craigslist or something like that, because almost every place now does a cylinder exchange rather than actually refilling the tank, and you can take some kind of not so great looking tank in and get a brand new, clean, beautiful tank. Just don't buy a brand new, beautiful, clean tank on Amazon and take it in thinking, I'm going to have this pretty tank, because they're going to hand you a tank that's seen some use. And it's not going to be the prettiest thing compared to that brand new, untouched, beautiful thing you have. So buy the cheap, kind of ratty one off of Craigslist or, OfferUp, any of those local things that you can find somebody local who tried to grow basement tomatoes and gave up because they realized they can't do it, or they don't want to invest $30,000 in lights and profit off of their stupidity. That's my suggestion as opposed to using liquid carbon. Do I occasionally use liquid carbon for very small purposes? Blackbeard algae? Yes. Would I rather use hydrogen peroxide? Yes. Algae tricks, we can talk about those. That's not plants.
Now, when you start CO2,
Yeah.
you've been dosing fertilizers like the Easy Green. Is there like a simple way to judge how much more ferts you should add when you're doing CO2?
Sure. So that's a good question that I didn't directly address. As your plants grow, you'll need more fertilizer. It's kind of the easy one. Really, the easiest way is to eyeball it, is to watch their growth over time. Because again, you can just trim them and kind of reset your cycle. In general, if my plants are all only 50% of the top of my tank, and then they grow out, I add let's say I'm doing a 40 breeder, for example, right? And all my plants have grown to the top of the tank, and I've got it pretty dense compared to when I started. I'll add an extra pump, so 25%. It really doesn't take a lot, because once that's established down there, you're going to have a mulm layer that builds up into your substrate, and that just kind of adds extra nutrients over time. So the difference in the amount you need to dose with fertilizer can be very small.
Is it hard to overdose?
The likeliness of you overdosing is pretty low. Just don't look at it and go, 1 pump per 10 gallons once a week. 10-gallon tank. 20 pumps. Don't do that. But if it's like normally I'm supposed to do 4 pumps once a week, and even if it grows all the way up and you do 4 pumps twice a week, but you spread it out 3 or 4 days between, it's fine. One of the things that I've slowly adjusted to as a personal thing, just for how I like to keep my tanks, is I will dose 1/4 my water volume every day. That's the closest to EI dosing I've ever done, and that's only when I'm really trying to push growth. Say like before the Aquatic Gardeners Association, where there's an auction where I can sell plants that may or may not happen before this video ever comes out. Or like if there's a swap or something I'm going to, or maybe a larger auction for my club where I can have more plants for sale. For the month before, I'll kind of prep by pushing my fertilizer dose into a different schedule than the easy green simple schedule. And that's literally just, while I'm feeding my fish, I'm walking around with a bottle of fertilizer and just fish, and it's done, right? It's simple, it's fast, I do it at the same time I'm feeding my fish, and it's easy. Hence the name, Easy Green. And all the liquids are like that. They're all super simple. They're basically built to take the difficulty away so that you can enjoy the after effect. Which is why I kind of, as a lazy person, and also whenever I give advice, I just generally suggest an all-in-one fertilizer. And only if you have some very large swords or like a Madagascar lace, something that feeds at the roots really hard, then maybe you'll do like a root tab near the root of that plant once every 3 months. But realistically, that plant over time, if it's in an aqua soil, will adjust and it will pull all the nutrients it needs out of the water column, and you won't have to worry about it. You just dose the all-in-one fertilizer and can make it easy on yourself. However, if you want to go crazy and do EI, good luck. I am way too lazy for that, but I wish you the best. Any last questions? Shoot.
When you were talking about dirty tanks.
Yeah.
You said that a heavily stocked dirty tank over time will struggle. What does that struggling look like?
You'll build up way more nitrates than the plants can handle. So you don't ever want to gravel vac a dirted tank.
The bioload gets a little too heavy.
And the problem is the moam layer that would normally slowly adjust down in through the more porous sections of your substrate that you create with like an aqua soil or a gravel, it's just going to land basically flat. And because typically you'll have either a sand or a very thin gravel cap over that dirt, that moam layer will build up. And when you try to gravel vac that out, you're going to pull up more dirt than you ever want to, and it's going to become a nightmare and a headache. This being said, the Wallstead method was specifically designed to use very low demanding plants, like your Anubiuses, Java Ferns, all those low light plants that we know that are basically bulletproof, unless you're Dean. And, sorry Dean, you brought it on yourself. You're way better at fish than I'm ever going to be, so there's that for you. But it's designed for the low demanding plants with a low bio load, and for the most part it's designed to have almost no water flow and no filter, no nothing. It just lets the plants do everything. That's the way that method was designed. There are plenty of people who will preach that the dirted tank is the only way to go, and they'll do that on a heavily stocked tank, and ask all of them how long that tank has been set up for. And see how many of them will say 5, 6, 7 years compared to the people who will use a decent aqua soil and the same results. And I guarantee you, the aqua soil will win every time. Is it more expensive? Oh yeah. Oh yeah, dirt's cheap. But
Relative to 7 years, a $30 bag of aqua soil versus a $10 bag.
exactly, and a lot of there's all sorts of stuff you can talk about substrates. But basically, put the thing that I like to look at is this: a bag of fluval stratum, which is equivalent to like 7 other different equivalents. But of course, ADA Amazonia is completely different. It's not. There's a very small difference, but it's not enough. They're all built to hold up. They'll only say that they're going to hold up for a certain number of years and you need to recycle them. I can tell you all sorts of people I know who have had the same ADA or whatever Tropica, whichever version of that Brightwell that they've bought. And they've moved it from 4 different tanks over the last 7 years, and it's still fine. I have a tank I inherited from someone. I inherited all of his substrate because it was all ADA Amazonia mixed with Echo Complete, and it's pristine. And that tank I know had been running for 5 years before it ever came to me, and it's been running for another 2.5 years since. And it's fine. I could not say the same with dirt. Typically, a dirted tank you need to reset every certain number of years. Now, if you're a big aquascaper, or maybe you're not like me, and you're not basically every time you set up a tank, you've married yourself to it, and you don't really want it to change because you're a psycho, which I am. That's probably fine because it lets you change that tank out every once in a while, and the life cycle is just going to be there until you've gotten bored. But if you're a weirdo like me, who wants to get every mile out of every buck possible, you're probably never touching the dirted tank method. Like I haven't. That's not true. I've played with dirted for like a month, and then I decided it was not worth the mess.
Same.
And I took that little 10-gallon and I went,
Yep.
cleaned it out, never again. All right.
Where would you put bulbs as a classification on a rosette plant, or are they kind of something special?
So like Aponogetans, for example, which are technically a bulb-based plant, they work under the same concept as a rosette. But they are technically their own category, yes. However, there are very few bulb-based plants. An example would be like red tiger lotus technically starts in a bulb for most people. However, you break that red tiger lotus off of a bulb and it'll throw a runner just like any other rosette plant will over time. And eventually that bulb, if you give it light and it sits in the water, will eventually grow another plant. Ask me how I know. I went from 1 bulb and 1 red tiger lotus to almost 35 of them before I decided I can sell a few of these. I don't think I need this many in the tank anymore. It takes over half my tank. I should probably get rid of some out of the 125.
I have 2 bulbs that are sitting in my tank now, and they've just been sitting there doing nothing. I looked at them the other day. They have 2 little plants, one coming out of each one.
Yeah, they'll do it. It's crazy how some of those plants work. Anyway, that's going to be my talk as far as recording is concerned, but I'll field extra questions for you guys if you have them. Thank you very much for listening to me babble for a lot longer than I originally intended.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's our family.